The grand ballroom of the Riverside Manor sparkled with thousands of white roses and crystal chandeliers. Madison Carter stood at the altar in her flowing ivory gown, her heart racing as she waited for the moment she'd dreamed of since childhood. The soft melody of the wedding march filled the air, and 300 guests rose to their feet. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. But something was wrong. Her maid of honor, Jessica Reynolds, hadn't returned from the bridal suite. Madison's eyes scanned the crowd, searching for her best friend's familiar auburn hair and warm smile. They'd been inseparable since college roommates at Northwestern University, sharing everything from late-night study sessions to career dreams. Jessica was supposed to be standing right beside her on the most important day of her life. Where is she? Madison whispered to her younger sister Emily, who was serving as the second bridesmaid. Emily shifted nervously in her dusty rose dress. I'm not sure. She said she needed to powder her nose 20 minutes ago. Pastor Williams cleared his throat gently, maintaining his practiced smile, while the wedding photographer continued snapping pictures of the increasingly awkward delay. Madison's fiancé, Ryan Mitchell, reached for her hand with a reassuring squeeze, but she noticed his palm was unusually sweaty. Should we start without her? Ryan asked quietly, his usually confident voice carrying an odd tremor. Madison shook her head firmly. No, absolutely not. Jessica would never miss this. Something must be wrong. In the front row, Madison's mother, Patricia Carter, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though Madison couldn't tell if the tears were from joy or growing concern. Her father, Robert Carter, checked his gold watch and frowned deeply. I'll go check on her, Emily offered, gathering her dress to head toward the bridal suite. Wait, Madison called out, then turned to address their guests with an apologetic smile. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a brief pause in our ceremony. Please remain seated while we ensure everything is perfect for this special moment. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Madison, still in her wedding gown, made the unprecedented decision to leave the altar. Ryan called after her, but she was already walking down the aisle with determination, her cathedral train trailing behind her like a silk river. The bridal suite was located on the second floor of the manor, accessible through an elegant spiral staircase. Madison climbed carefully, gathering her dress to avoid tripping. The hallway was eerily quiet compared to the bustling activity downstairs. As she approached the ornate wooden door, she heard voices inside. One was definitely Jessica's, but it was strained, almost panicked. The other voice was male, familiar, but she couldn't quite place it through the thick door. Madison pressed her ear closer, her heart beginning to pound, for reasons she couldn't yet understand. You have to tell her, Jessica. She deserves to know before she says I do. I can't! It would destroy everything. The wedding, our friendship, her entire life. How can I walk down there and ruin the happiest day of her life? And what about our situation? What about the baby? Madison's gonna find out eventually. Wouldn't it be better coming from you rather than discovering it months from now? The word baby hit Madison like a physical blow. She gripped the doorframe for support, her knees suddenly weak. Jessica was pregnant? Why hadn't she told her? They shared everything, or so she thought. Ryan, please, Jessica's voice cracked. I never meant for this to happen. That night, 6 weeks ago, we were both so drunk, and Madison was out of town for her bachelorette party in Miami. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. Madison's world tilted on its axis. Ryan? Her Ryan was in there with Jessica talking about a baby? About a night 6 weeks ago when she was indeed in Miami, celebrating with her sorority sisters? Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle, but she stopped herself. Part of her wanted to burst in immediately, to confront them both and demand answers. But another part of her needed to hear more, to understand the full scope of what was happening on what was supposed to be the most beautiful day of her life. I know it was a mistake, Ryan's voice continued, and Madison had never heard him sound so defeated. But the pregnancy test doesn't lie. And I can't marry Madison knowing what we've done, knowing that you're carrying my child. But what choice do we have? Jessica sobbed. She's standing at the altar right now, waiting for you. 300 people are downstairs expecting a wedding. Her parents spent $50,000 on this reception. The honeymoon to Paris is already booked. How do we destroy all of that? Madison sank against the wall, her carefully styled hair catching on the wallpaper. 6 weeks ago, while she was celebrating her upcoming marriage with champagne and laughter on a Miami beach, her fiancé and her best friend were betraying her in the worst possible way. The details came flooding back now with horrifying clarity. She remembered calling Ryan that night from Miami, around midnight Eastern time, and he hadn't answered. When she'd asked him about it the next day, he'd said he was out with the guys and had left his phone in the car. She'd believed him completely, trusting him the way she'd trusted him for the past 3 years. And Jessica, sweet, loyal Jessica, who had helped her pick out this very wedding dress, who had thrown her the most elaborate bridal shower, who had been by her side through every wedding planning decision. Jessica, who had been unusually quiet and pale for the past month, claiming it was just stress from her new job at the marketing firm. "Maybe we should just proceed with the wedding," Ryan said, his voice barely audible through the door. "Madison never has to know. You could handle the situation quietly, and we could all move on with our lives." Handle the situation? Jessica's voice turned sharp. "You mean get rid of the baby? Ryan, I'm 12 weeks pregnant. I've already heard the heartbeat. I've seen the ultrasound. This isn't just a situation anymore. 12 weeks. Madison did quick math in her head, counting backward from today's date. The timeline was becoming clearer, and it made her physically ill. This wasn't just a one-night mistake. If Jessica was 12 weeks pregnant, this had been going on much longer than 6 weeks ago. "You're right," Ryan admitted. "I'm sorry, I don't know how to handle this. I love Madison, but I can't pretend this didn't happen. And if you're keeping the baby—" "I haven't decided anything yet," Jessica interrupted. "But I needed you to know before the wedding. I couldn't stand there as her maid of honor, watching you two exchange vows, knowing what we've done. It felt like the worst kind of betrayal." Madison almost laughed at the irony. Jessica was worried about feeling like she was betraying her, while she'd already been betraying her for months. A soft knock on another door inside the suite made both voices fall silent. "Miss Reynolds?" came a voice Madison recognized as belonging to the wedding coordinator. "The ceremony is about to resume. Mrs. Carter is looking for you." Madison's breath caught. She couldn't be found here, eavesdropping outside the bridal suite. She quickly but quietly moved away from the door, pressing herself into an alcove near a large window that overlooked the manor's gardens. The door opened, and Jessica emerged first, her face puffy and red from crying. She'd attempted to fix her makeup, but Madison could see the streaks of mascara she'd missed. Jessica's usually perfect posture was slumped, and she moved like someone carrying an enormous weight. Ryan appeared a moment later, adjusting his tie and running his hands through his dark hair. He looked pale and shaken, nothing like the confident, excited groom he'd been just an hour earlier during their first look photos. They didn't speak to each other as they headed toward the staircase, maintaining a careful distance that seemed practiced, as if they'd been hiding their connection for some time. Madison waited until she could no longer hear their footsteps before emerging from her hiding spot. She stood alone in the hallway, still in her wedding gown, facing the most devastating moment of her life. Everything she thought she knew was a lie. Her 3-year relationship with Ryan, built on what she believed was trust and mutual respect, was crumbling before her eyes. Her friendship with Jessica, the person she'd considered closer than a sister, was revealed to be a facade hiding months of deception. As she slowly made her way back toward the staircase, Madison's mind raced through her options. She could confront them both immediately, creating a scene that would forever be remembered by everyone present. She could go through with the wedding and deal with the consequences later, protecting everyone's dignity in the short term. Or she could find a third option, something that would give her back some control in a situation where she felt utterly powerless. The sound of organ music drifted up from the ballroom below, where 300 guests waited for her return. Her parents, Ryan's parents, extended family, college friends, work colleagues, and neighbors all expected to witness the union of Madison Carter and Ryan Mitchell. Instead, they were about to witness something none of them could have anticipated. Madison paused at the top of the staircase, her hand gripping the banister as she looked down at the scene below. She could see the back of Ryan's head as he stood at the altar, presumably believing that his secret was still safe. Jessica had taken her place beside Emily, holding the bouquet of white peonies Madison had specifically chosen to match Jessica's eyes. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. For a moment, Madison considered the possibility that she'd misunderstood what she'd heard. Maybe there was an explanation that didn't involve betrayal and pregnancy and lies. Maybe Jessica was helping another friend through a crisis, and Ryan just happened to be there offering support. But deep down, she knew the truth. The pieces fit too perfectly, explaining too many small inconsistencies she'd ignored over the past few months. Ryan's increased work hours, Jessica's morning sickness that she'd attributed to food poisoning, the way they'd both seemed nervous whenever all three of them were together recently. As Madison began her descent down the staircase, she made her decision. Whiffus turned to watch her return, smiling and whispering about how beautiful she looked. Patricia Carter dabbed at her eyes again, this time clearly from joy at seeing her daughter coming back to complete her special day. But Madison wasn't returning to complete anything. She was returning to reveal everything. With each step down the spiral staircase, her resolve strengthened. By the time she reached the bottom, she knew exactly what she was going to do. The truth would come out today, in front of everyone who mattered to her. If her wedding day was going to be memorable, it would be memorable for the right reasons, not because she'd allowed herself to be deceived, but because she'd found the courage to demand honesty when it mattered most. Madison walked through the ballroom's ornate entrance, with the poise of someone who had practiced this moment 1,000 times in her mind. The guests' expectant faces turned toward her, relieved smiles spreading across the room as their concerns about the delay evaporated. Her father stepped forward to escort her back down the aisle, offering his arm with the same proud expression he'd worn during their rehearsal dinner just 2 nights ago. "Everything all right, sweetheart?" Robert Carter whispered, his steel-gray eyes searching her face for any sign of distress. Madison managed a smile that felt foreign on her lips. "Just some last-minute touch-ups, Dad. You know how important it is for everything to be perfect." The irony of her words wasn't lost on her, but Robert nodded approvingly. He'd built his construction company from the ground up, and he appreciated attention to detail. Madison had inherited that trait from him, which made the current situation even more devastating. She prided herself on being observant, on reading people well, on never being caught off guard. Yet here she was, blindsided on the most important day of her life. As they began walking down the aisle for the second time, Madison's eyes swept across the familiar faces in the crowd. Her college sorority sister sat in the third row, still close friends who had supported her through everything from failed job interviews to her father's heart attack 2 years ago. They looked radiant in their coordinated navy dresses, beaming with happiness for her upcoming union. In the fifth row sat her colleagues from Henderson & Associates, the law firm where she worked as a senior paralegal. Her boss, Margaret Henderson, had given her an extra week off for the honeymoon, and had spoken glowingly about Madison's dedication during the reception toast rehearsal. These people respected her, admired her judgment, and looked up to her professional accomplishments. Ryan's side of the church was equally filled with supporters. His medical school classmates, now fellow residents at Chicago General Hospital, had traveled from across the country to be here. His childhood friends from his hometown of Springfield sat with their wives and young children, representing the future Madison had imagined for herself and Ryan. At the altar, Ryan waited with what everyone would interpret as nervous excitement. Pastor Williams stood ready to begin the ceremony that had been 3 months in the planning. The string quartet, positioned near the front, adjusted their instruments, prepared to play the special arrangement of Canon in D that Madison had specifically requested. Jessica remained in her position as maid of honor, having somehow composed herself enough to hide the emotional turmoil Madison had witnessed upstairs. She held Madison's bouquet with steady hands, her smile perfectly practiced. To everyone in the room, she looked like the devoted best friend who was overjoyed to witness her closest companion's happiness. But Madison could see what others couldn't. She noticed how Jessica avoided direct eye contact with Ryan, how her shoulders remained tense despite her smile, how she kept shifting her weight from foot to foot in a nervous rhythm. Most telling of all, Madison could see that Jessica's left hand trembled slightly as she clutched the bouquet. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Williams began, his warm voice carrying easily through the high-ceilinged ballroom, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Madison Elizabeth Carter and Ryan James Mitchell in holy matrimony." The traditional words washed over Madison, but she found herself studying Ryan's face instead of listening to the familiar ceremony. She'd known him for 3 years, had been engaged to him for 8 months, and yet suddenly he felt like a stranger. When has the easy intimacy between them been replaced by careful distance? When had his spontaneous laughter become measured and infrequent? She thought back to their early relationship, remembering how they'd met at a charity fundraiser for the children's hospital where Ryan volunteered. She'd been there representing her law firm's pro bono work, and he'd been there because he genuinely cared about helping sick children. Their first conversation had lasted 4 hours, covering everything from their career ambitions to their shared love of hiking and travel. Ryan had pursued her with the same intensity he brought to his medical studies. He sent flowers to her office, planned thoughtful dates that catered to her interests, and introduced her to his family within 2 months of dating. Madison had fallen hard for his combination of ambition and kindness, his ability to make her laugh after stressful days at work, and his unwavering support for her goals. The engagement had felt natural, inevitable even. Ryan had proposed during a weekend trip to the Wisconsin Dells, at the exact spot where they'd shared their first kiss a year earlier. The ring was everything Madison had ever dreamed of, a classic solitaire setting, with a 2-carat diamond that caught the light beautifully. She'd called Jessica within minutes of saying yes, and Jessica had screamed with excitement before rushing over to celebrate with champagne and tears of joy. Now Madison wondered if those tears had been genuine, or if Jessica had already been harboring feelings for Ryan that she couldn't express. Had there been signs she'd missed? Moments when Jessica had lingered too long when Ryan visited Madison's apartment? Times when Jessica had asked too many questions about Ryan's schedule or whereabouts? Marriage is not a commitment to be entered into lightly, Pastor Williams continued, his words taking on new meaning in Madison's current circumstances. It requires honesty, trust, and the willingness to put another person's needs above your own. Madison glanced toward her mother, who sat in the front row with tears streaming down her face. Patricia Carter had planned this wedding with the enthusiasm of someone living out her own dreams. She'd insisted on the most expensive flowers, the finest catering, the most elegant venue. This wedding was as much about Patricia's vision of perfection as it was about Madison's happiness. Growing up, Madison had watched her parents navigate what appeared to be a strong marriage. Robert worked long hours building his business, while Patricia managed their home and social obligations with military precision. They rarely fought in front of Madison and her sister, presenting a united front that had given Madison confidence in the institution of marriage itself. But she'd also noticed the way they sometimes seemed to live parallel lives, rather than truly connected ones. Robert would come home exhausted from construction sites, while Patricia would be energized from her volunteer work and social committees. They shared responsibilities and mutual respect, but Madison had sometimes wondered if they still shared passion. She'd promised herself that her marriage to Ryan would be different. They would maintain intimacy and communication even as their careers demanded more time and energy. They would travel together, support each other's dreams, and never let routine replace romance. Those promises felt naive now, standing at an altar where she was about to marry someone who had betrayed her in the most fundamental way possible. Emily caught Madison's eye from her position as second bridesmaid, offering an encouraging smile. At 23, Emily still possessed the optimism that Madison felt slipping away from her own heart. Emily believed in fairy tales and happy endings, in the power of love to overcome any obstacle. She'd been Madison's biggest supporter throughout the wedding planning, helping with every detail from addressing invitations to organizing the bachelorette party. Madison realized that Emily would be devastated by what was about to unfold. Her younger sister looked up to her, used her relationship with Ryan as a model for her own romantic expectations. Emily had often mentioned how she hoped to find someone as perfect as Ryan, someone who would love her the way Ryan supposedly loved Madison. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Madison's shoulders. Her decision in the next few minutes wouldn't just affect her own life. It would impact her parents, who had invested so much in this day both financially and emotionally. It would affect Ryan's family, who had welcomed her with open arms and were already planning Christmas celebrations that included her. It would devastate Emily's romantic idealism and potentially damage Jessica's reputation permanently. But as Pastor Williams asked for the rings and began the portion of the ceremony where vows would be exchanged, Madison knew she couldn't sacrifice her own integrity to protect everyone else's comfort. Ryan turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his with the gentle touch she'd fallen in love with. His dark eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw the man she'd agreed to marry. He looked vulnerable, hopeful, and genuinely happy to be standing here with her. It made what she was about to do infinitely harder, but no less necessary. The truth had a way of revealing itself eventually. Madison could either be in control of that revelation, or she could let it destroy her life piece by piece over the coming months and years. She squeezed Ryan's hands once, gently, and saw his expression shift to surprise at the intensity in her eyes. The moment of reckoning had arrived. "Before we continue with the exchange of vows," Madison said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom, "there's something important I need to share with everyone here today." A ripple of confusion moved through the gathered guests. Pastor Williams blinked in surprise, his prepared script momentarily forgotten. Ryan's hands tightened around Madison's, his expression shifting from loving anticipation to barely concealed panic. "Madison," he whispered urgently, "what are you doing?" She gently pulled her hands free from his grasp and turned to address their wedding guests. 300 faces looked back at her with varying degrees of curiosity, concern, and growing alarm. "6 months ago," Madison began, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart, "when Ryan and I decided to get married, I thought I knew everything about the man I was going to spend my life with. I thought I knew everything about the people closest to me." Jessica's face had gone completely white. She swayed slightly on her feet, and Emily instinctively stepped closer to steady her. The bouquet in Jessica's hands began to tremble visibly. Madison's mind drifted back to the beginning, to the moments that had led them all to this devastating revelation. She needed people to understand how they'd arrived here, how relationships that seemed unshakable had been built on foundations of sand. This story really began 18 months earlier, during Madison's promotion celebration at Henderson and Associates. She'd finally been made senior paralegal, a position she'd worked toward for 3 years. Ryan had planned a surprise party at their favorite restaurant, inviting both their families and close friends to celebrate her achievement. Jessica had been the first to arrive that night, carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the emerald green dress that made her auburn hair look like fire. She'd embraced Madison with genuine enthusiasm, praising her hard work and dedication. Throughout the evening, Jessica had been the perfect best friend, organizing toasts, taking photos, making sure everyone felt included in the celebration. But Madison remembered now how Jessica's demeanor had changed when Ryan gave his toast. He'd spoken about Madison's intelligence, her determination, her ability to balance career ambitions with personal relationships. As he talked about their future together, their plans for marriage and family, Jessica's smile had become increasingly strained. At the time, Madison had attributed Jessica's mood shift to her own relationship struggles. Jessica had been dating a marketing executive named David Thompson for 6 months, and the relationship was clearly not progressing the way she'd hoped. David was charming but commitment-phobic, the type of man who planned dates week by week rather than building toward a future. Jessica's just feeling pressure about her own love life, Madison had confided to Ryan later that night as they cleaned up the remnants of the party. "She's watching us get more serious, and it's making her realize that David isn't husband material." Ryan had nodded sympathetically, helping Madison load the dishwasher in her downtown apartment. "Maybe we should set her up with someone from the hospital. Dr. Marcus Webb just got divorced, and he's a good guy." The suggestion had seemed caring at the time, evidence of Ryan's desire to see Jessica happy. Now Madison wondered if his eagerness to find Jessica another romantic interest had been motivated by guilt rather than friendship. Looking back with the clarity that betrayal provides, Madison could identify other moments that should have raised red flags. There was the evening 3 months later when she'd come home from a late work meeting to find Ryan and Jessica sitting unusually close together on her couch, watching a movie. They'd both seemed startled by her arrival, claiming they'd been discussing surprise plans for Madison's upcoming birthday. The birthday surprise had indeed been spectacular. A weekend trip to a cozy bed and breakfast in Door County, complete with wine tastings and scenic hiking trails. Madison had been touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift, never questioning how Ryan had known about her desire to visit that specific region. She'd mentioned it only once, months earlier, during a conversation with Jessica about places they wanted to travel. Then there was the night of Madison's bachelorette party in Miami, the trip that had apparently provided Ryan and Jessica with the opportunity for their first betrayal. Madison's sorority sisters had planned an elaborate weekend filled with beach activities, spa treatments, and nightlife. Jessica had been enthusiastic about the plans, helping to coordinate flights and accommodations. But 2 weeks before the trip, Jessica had suddenly announced she couldn't attend. She'd claimed that her boss at the marketing firm had scheduled a crucial client presentation that weekend, making it impossible for her to leave town. Madison had been disappointed but understanding, knowing how important Jessica's career was to her. "I'll make it up to you," Jessica had promised, hugging Madison tightly. "When you get back, we'll have our own celebration, just the two of us, like old times." The promised celebration had never happened. When Madison returned from Miami, glowing with excitement and eager to share stories about her weekend, Jessica had seemed distant and distracted. She'd claimed to be exhausted from work stress and had canceled their planned dinner twice before they finally met for coffee at their usual cafe near Northwestern's campus. During that coffee meeting, Jessica had seemed almost guilty, asking repeated questions about Madison's trip while offering little information about her own weekend. She'd been pale and tired-looking, attributes Madison had chalked up to Jessica's demanding new position at the marketing firm. You need to take better care of yourself, Madison had said with concern, reaching across the table to squeeze Jessica's hand. You look like you haven't been sleeping well. Jessica had pulled her hand away quickly, mumbling something about insomnia and too much caffeine. The conversation had felt stilted, lacking the easy flow that had characterized their friendship since college. Now Madison understood why. Jessica had been carrying the weight of her betrayal, unable to look Madison in the eye without remembering what she'd done with Ryan just days earlier. The pattern had continued over the following months. Jessica would be enthusiastic about wedding planning during group activities, dress shopping, venue visits, menu tastings, but she'd grown increasingly withdrawn during private conversations with Madison. She'd stopped sharing details about her own dating life, claiming she was taking a break from romance to focus on her career. Ryan, meanwhile, had become more attentive to Madison in some ways and more distant in others. He'd increased his romantic gestures, surprise flowers, thoughtful gifts, spontaneous date nights, but he'd also become less emotionally available. Their deep conversations about the future had been replaced by surface-level discussions about wedding logistics and work schedules. Madison had noticed that Ryan seemed uncomfortable whenever Jessica was around, but she'd interpreted his behavior as concern for Jessica's emotional state. She'd thought he was being sensitive to Jessica's single status, trying not to appear too couple-focused when Jessica was struggling with her own romantic disappointments. The most telling sign had been Ryan's reaction to Madison's suggestion that Jessica should be her maid of honor. Madison had expected him to be pleased about including her best friend in such an important role, but instead he'd seemed hesitant. "Are you sure?" he'd asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I mean, Jessica's great, but maybe Emily would be honored to be your maid of honor instead?" Madison had been surprised by his response. "Emily's going to be a bridesmaid, of course, but Jessica and I have been planning this since college. She's been my closest friend for years. There's no one else I'd rather have standing beside me." Ryan hadn't argued further, but Madison remembered now how his jaw had tightened when she'd made the final decision. At the time, she'd thought he was just feeling protective of Emily's feelings. Now she understood that he'd been dreading the months of wedding planning that would require him to maintain his deception while interacting regularly with both women. Standing at the altar now, Madison looked directly at Jessica and saw the truth written across her face. Jessica's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes, the pallor of her skin, or the way she seemed to be holding herself together through sheer force of will. "Jessica," Madison said gently, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone Pastor Williams wore, "would you like to tell everyone why you've been so tired lately? Why have you been avoiding certain foods? Why did you cancel your doctor's appointment last week to reschedule it for next month?" Jessica's knees buckled slightly, and she reached out to grip Emily's arm for support. The bouquet fell from her other hand, white peonies scattering across the altar steps like fallen snow. In the stunned silence that followed, the truth hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to break open and change everything forever. The scattered peonies at Jessica's feet seemed to echo the fragments of broken trust, now littering the altar. Emily's grip on Jessica's arm tightened as she looked between her sister and her supposed best friend, confusion clouding her young features. "Madison, what's going on?" Emily whispered, but her voice carried in the deadly silence of the ballroom. Ryan stepped forward, his medical training kicking in as he saw Jessica swaying dangerously. "Jess, you need to sit down. You're going to faint." The casual use of the nickname Jess sent another shockwave through Madison. When had Ryan started calling her that? In all their years of friendship, Madison had always called her Jessica, and Ryan had followed suit. The intimate shortening of her name suggested a level of closeness that went far beyond casual friendship. "Don't touch her," Madison said sharply, causing Ryan to freeze mid-reach. "I think you've done enough already." Patricia Carter rose from her seat in the front row, her face a mask of horror and confusion. "Madison Elizabeth, what is the meaning of this? You're embarrassing your family in front of our friends." "Am I embarrassing the family, Mother?" Madison turned to face the sea of stunned guests. "Or am I finally telling the truth that everyone deserves to hear?" Dr. Michael Mitchell, Ryan's father, stood up as well, his physician's demeanor calm but alert. "Perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere more private. There are clearly some misunderstandings that need to be resolved." "There's no misunderstanding," Madison replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Ryan, why don't you tell your father about the baby? I'm sure he'd love to know he's going to be a grandfather." The color drained from Ryan's face completely. Several guests gasped audibly, and a low murmur began to ripple through the crowd. Margaret Henderson, Madison's boss, leaned forward in her seat, her legal mind clearly processing the implications of what was unfolding. "Madison, please," Ryan begged, reaching for her hands again. "Let me explain. It's not what you think." "It's not what I think?" Madison's voice rose slightly, carrying clearly to the back of the ballroom. "So, Jessica isn't 12 weeks pregnant with your child? So you didn't sleep with my maid of honor while I was celebrating our upcoming marriage in Miami?" Jessica finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Madison, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." "You never meant for it to happen," Madison repeated slowly. "Jessica, help me understand. Did you accidentally end up in bed with my fiancé? Did you accidentally continue the affair for months? Did you accidentally decide not to tell me before today?" Emily released Jessica's arm and stepped back, her face reflecting the dawning realization of what she was witnessing. "You've been sleeping with Ryan? While Madison was planning your wedding?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Jessica's silence was enough. Robert Carter, who had built his construction empire on the foundation of keeping his word, looked at Ryan with undisguised disgust. "Son, is this true? Have you been unfaithful to my daughter?" Ryan's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Mr. Carter, Yes, but it's complicated." "Complicated?" Robert's voice boomed across the ballroom. "You gave me your word. You asked for my blessing to marry my daughter, and I gave it to you because I believed you were a man of honor." Margaret Henderson stood up from her seat, her legal instincts recognizing that this situation was about to spiral beyond anyone's control. Perhaps the family should discuss this privately. The guests could be asked to... "No," Madison interrupted firmly. "These people took time out of their lives to witness what they believed would be the happiest day of my life. They brought gifts, they traveled from across the country, they invested emotionally in our relationship. They deserve to know the truth about what kind of man they were celebrating." Ryan's best man, Dr. Marcus Webb, finally stepped forward from his position near the altar. "Ryan, maybe you should listen to Mrs. Henderson. This isn't the place for this conversation." "Actually, Marcus," Madison said, turning to face Ryan's longtime friend, "this is exactly the place for this conversation. How long have you known?" Marcus's face flushed red. "Know what? I don't know what you're talking about." "Really? Because Jessica mentioned that she's 12 weeks pregnant. That means this affair started during the engagement party at the country club. You were there that night. You saw how Ryan and Jessica interacted. Did you notice anything unusual?" The engagement party. Madison's mind raced back to that evening 6 months ago. The Springfield Country Club had been decorated with spring flowers and twinkling lights. Ryan's medical school friends had come together to celebrate, along with both families and close friends from college. Madison remembered the evening as magical, but now details were clicking into place with horrible clarity. Ryan had disappeared for nearly an hour during the cocktail reception, claiming he needed to take an important call from the hospital. Jessica had also been absent during that same period, saying she needed to make some work calls in private. When they'd both returned, they'd seemed flustered. Jessica's lipstick had been completely gone, and she'd claimed she'd been feeling nauseous and had spent time in the bathroom. Ryan's hair had been slightly mussed, and he'd seemed overly affectionate with Madison for the rest of the evening, as if overcompensating for something. "Marcus," Madison pressed, "you roomed with Ryan in medical school. You know him better than almost anyone. Are you really going to stand there and tell me you had no idea this was happening?" Marcus glanced at Ryan, then back at Madison. I thought something seemed off between them, but I never imagined..." "You never imagined that your best friend would betray the woman he claimed to love?" Madison's voice was getting stronger, more confident. "Or you never imagined he'd be stupid enough to get caught?" Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Ryan's mother, had been silent throughout the confrontation, but now she stood up with the dignity of someone accustomed to handling medical crises. "Jessica, dear, is what Madison is saying true? Are you pregnant with my son's child?" Jessica looked up at Dr. Mitchell with tears streaming down her face. Ryan's mother had always been kind to Jessica, treating her like a daughter whenever she'd visited their home. The betrayal was written across Jessica's features as she nodded silently. "How far along?" Dr. Mitchell asked, her physician's training taking over. 12 weeks, Jessica whispered. Dr. Mitchell's eyes widened slightly as she did the same mathematical calculation Madison had done earlier. The timeline. This began before Christmas. You've been lying to everyone for months. Patricia Carter sank back into her seat, her hand pressed to her chest. $50,000, she whispered. We spent $50,000 on this wedding. Patricia, that's not what matters right now, Robert said sharply, but his wife's comment had sparked something in the crowd. Madison's sorority sisters were whispering among themselves, their faces showing a mix of shock and anger. These women had thrown Jessica a bridal shower gift from Madison just 3 weeks ago. They'd laughed and celebrated with her, completely unaware that she was carrying the groom's child. The wedding photographer, who had been discreetly documenting the ceremony, continued taking pictures. Madison realized that every moment of this devastating revelation was being captured on film, creating a permanent record of the worst day of her life. But strangely, the thought didn't bother her. Let there be evidence. Let everyone remember exactly how this unfolded, so there could be no revisionist history later. No claims that things had been misunderstood or exaggerated. Ryan, Madison said, turning back to face the man she'd thought she would spend her life with. You have one chance to be completely honest. Right here, right now, in front of everyone. How long has this been going on? How many times did you betray me? And what exactly did you plan to do about the baby? Ryan looked out at the sea of faces staring back at him. His family, his friends, his colleagues, all waiting for his answer. His career as a physician depended on trust and integrity. His relationships with everyone in this room hung in the balance. For the first time since Madison had known him, Ryan appeared to be completely without words. Ryan's silence stretched across the ballroom like a held breath. 300 guests watched as the man who had promised to love, honor, and cherish Madison struggled to find words that could somehow explain away months of deception. The truth, Ryan, Madison said quietly, her voice now steady and commanding. No more lies, no more excuses, just the truth. Ryan's hands shook as he ran them through his hair. A nervous gesture Madison had once found endearing. It started after your promotion party, he finally said, his voice barely audible. Jessica and I were cleaning up after everyone left, and we started talking about relationships, about the future. One thing led to another and You kissed, Madison finished for him, in my apartment while I was in the shower, trusting both of you completely. Ryan nodded miserably. We agreed it was a mistake. We promised each other it would never happen again. But it did happen again, Jessica said suddenly, her voice stronger now that the secret was finally out. It happened again at the engagement party, and then again after the venue booking, and then… Enough, Dr. Mitchell interrupted, her face pale with embarrassment for her son. I think we've heard enough details. But Madison wasn't finished. No, I want to hear it all. Jessica, how many times? How often were you betraying our friendship? Jessica wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her carefully applied makeup. Madison, it wasn't supposed to mean anything. We were both confused about our feelings, and you seemed so happy, so sure about everything. Ryan and I kept thinking we were protecting you by keeping it secret. Protecting me? Madison's voice rose incredulously. You were protecting yourselves. You were being cowards who couldn't face the consequences of your choices. Margaret Henderson approached the altar area, her legal experience helping her recognize that this situation needed immediate damage control. Madison, as your employer and your friend, I think you should consider stepping away from this public forum. Whatever decisions you need to make can be made privately. Madison turned to face her boss, a woman she respected enormously. Mrs. Henderson, with all due respect, privacy is what got us here. Privacy allowed Ryan and Jessica to betray me for months without consequences. I'm done with privacy. She turned back to address the entire gathered crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for subjecting you to this situation, but I want you to understand something important. What you're witnessing here isn't just about infidelity or broken promises. It's about the courage to demand truth when everyone around you is comfortable with lies. Patricia Carter stood up again, her social instincts kicking in. Madison, think about what you're doing. Think about your reputation, your future. Some things are better handled quietly. Like, Grandmother Carter handled grandfather's affairs? Madison shot back, referencing family history that Patricia had tried to keep buried for decades. Like you handled finding out about Dad's friendship with Linda Morrison when I was in high school? Robert Carter's face flushed red. The revelation of his emotional affair from years past was something the family had never discussed openly, another secret swept under the rug in the name of maintaining appearances. That's different, Patricia protested weakly. No, it's not different at all, Madison replied firmly. It's exactly the same pattern. Lies, secrets, and everyone pretending that ignoring the truth makes it go away. I refuse to start my marriage, any marriage, based on that foundation. Emily stepped forward, her young face showing a maturity beyond her 23 years. Madison's right, she said clearly. If we can't be honest about this, what else will we lie about? What other secrets will we keep because they're inconvenient? Ryan looked up hopefully at Emily's words, perhaps thinking she was advocating for forgiveness. Emily, thank you for understanding that people make mistakes. I'm not defending you. Emily interrupted sharply. I'm supporting my sister's right to make an informed decision about her life. You took that choice away from her by lying for months. Dr. Michael Mitchell approached his son with the disappointed expression of a father whose trust had been shattered. Ryan, I raised you to be better than this. Your mother and I taught you about integrity, about keeping your word. How could you dishonor not just Madison, but yourself and our family? Dad, I know I messed up, but Madison and I can work through this. People overcome infidelity all the time. We love each other. Madison turned to stare at Ryan with an expression that made him step backward. Love? You think this is about love? Ryan, you don't love me. If you loved me, you couldn't have looked me in the eye every day for months while carrying on an affair with my best friend. If you loved me, you couldn't have let me plan our wedding, choose our menu, pick out my dress knowing that you were betraying me. She gestured toward Jessica, who was now sitting on the altar steps, her head in her hands. And Jessica, our friendship wasn't built on love either, was it? It was built on convenience and shared history. A real friend would have told me the truth immediately, no matter how painful it was. The photographer continued documenting the scene, and Madison found herself oddly grateful for his presence. These images would serve as a reminder of her strength, not her humiliation. I want everyone here to witness something, Madison announced, reaching for the engagement ring on her left hand. I'm choosing truth over comfort. I'm choosing self-respect over social expectations. I'm choosing a difficult, honest future over an easy life built on lies. She slipped the 2-carat diamond from her finger and placed it carefully on the altar next to Pastor Williams, who had remained silent throughout the entire confrontation, his pastoral training apparently inadequate for this particular crisis. Ryan, I hope you and Jessica will be very happy together. I hope you'll raise your child with more honesty than you've shown me. But I will not be part of this deception any longer. Margaret Henderson stepped forward again. Madison, you're handling this with remarkable grace. If you need extended time off, or if you want to discuss any legal implications, please don't hesitate to contact me. Madison smiled gratefully at her boss. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I think I'll be back to work on Monday. I have a lot to rebuild, and staying busy will help. Robert Carter approached his daughter and placed a strong hand on her shoulder. Madison, I'm proud of you. This took tremendous courage. Thanks, Dad. I learned from watching you build your business that sometimes you have to tear down a weak foundation before you can build something solid. Patricia Carter remained seated, still processing the social implications of the canceled wedding. But even she seemed to recognize that her daughter had chosen the only path that maintained her dignity. Madison looked out at the gathered crowd one final time. To everyone who came here today expecting to celebrate love and commitment, I'm sorry you didn't get the wedding you planned to attend. But I hope you'll remember that real love requires real honesty, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept less than you deserve. She turned to Emily, who had tears streaming down her face. Em, will you help me out of this dress? I think it's time to start over. As the sisters walked arm in arm toward the bridal suite, Madison felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Complete peace with her choices. Behind them, the ballroom buzzed with conversation as guests tried to process what they'd witnessed. Ryan and Jessica remained at the altar, facing the consequences of their decisions without the shield of secrecy to protect them. The truth, as painful as it was, had finally set everyone free. Madison didn't know what her future held, but she knew it would be built on a foundation of honesty and self-respect. And for the first time in months, that felt like enough. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.